The cop's voice was sharp, cutting through the tense silence like a knife. "Get out of the car, now!" he barked, his hand resting dangerously close to his holstered gun. The black man inside the sleek black SUV remained calm, his face stoic. He wore a simple olive-green jacket over his pressed uniform. His posture was straight, shoulders squared, but his eyes betrayed the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. "I'm asking you one more time," the officer snapped, his voice growing more aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them." The man inside the car sighed deeply. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed open the door and stepped out, his tall frame emerging like a giant from a small box. The moment his polished boots hit the asphalt, the cop's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Turn around and face the car, hands on the hood." The man's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't move. "Officer, do you know who I am?" His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable authority, one that demanded respect. The officer sneered. "I don't care who you are. You're about to be under arrest for refusing to comply." In a flash, the cop lunged forward, shoving the man against the hood with unnecessary force. He yanked the man's arms behind his back, twisting them roughly. The sound of metal handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the quiet parking lot. Just then, the man tilted his head slightly and said, almost casually, "You're making a big mistake." The cop laughed bitterly. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Before the man could respond, a voice came from behind them. It was calm yet laced with authority that could silence a room. "Lieutenant General Charles Davis, United States Army." The officer froze. His face drained of color as he slowly turned his head to see another uniformed man, tall and imposing, stepping out of a nearby vehicle. A second later, two more military personnel appeared, their faces stone cold. The officer's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea who he'd just put in handcuffs, but judging by the looks of the men now approaching him, it was someone way out of his league. The man he had handcuffed, the one now revealed to be a U.S. Army general, gave him a piercing stare. "I warned you," General Davis said quietly. The officer stammered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He fumbled for his keys, his hands trembling as he hurried to unlock the cuffs. But the damage was already done. Hours earlier, the sun hung low in the evening sky, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. General Davis had just wrapped up a long day of meetings at the Pentagon. He was driving back to his family's home in Virginia, looking forward to a quiet evening with his wife and kids. His uniform, though formal, was a source of pride, representing decades of service and sacrifice. As he pulled into a gas station to fill up, he noticed a white police cruiser parked by the convenience store. The officer inside seemed to be watching him closely. Davis shrugged it off. It wasn't the first time he'd been eyed suspiciously in his own country, and it probably wouldn't be the last. After paying for his gas, Davis returned to his SUV and pulled back onto the road. He hadn't gone more than a few miles when flashing blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Confused, he glanced at his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run any lights. He signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, putting the car in park. The officer approached, his hand already resting on his gun. "License and registration," he said curtly. General Davis handed over his documents without a word, watching as the officer's eyes scanned them. Despite the military ID clearly stating his rank and name, the cop's expression didn't change. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer said. "Is there a problem, officer?" Davis asked calmly. "Do as I say, or I'll make you," the cop snapped. Davis sighed. "I'm an active-duty Army general. I have every right to know why I'm being asked to step out of my vehicle." The officer's eyes flickered with irritation. "Get out of the car. Now." As Davis unbuckled his seatbelt, he couldn't help but feel the familiar pang of anger and frustration. How many times had he, a decorated officer who had served his country faithfully for over 30 years, been reduced to nothing more than a suspect because of the color of his skin? The tension grew as Davis exited the vehicle. The cop's hand twitched near his gun, his body language screaming hostility. And that's when everything spiraled out of control. The officer's rough treatment, the unnecessary force, the public humiliation, it all happened so fast. But in the midst of the chaos, Davis remained calm. He knew his power didn't come from shouting or resisting. His power came from his rank, his position, and the countless lives he had led and protected. And now, the cop who had thought he was in control of the situation was beginning to realize he had made a colossal mistake. As the two other officers stepped forward, The senior one spoke into his radio. "We've got a situation. Call the precinct and tell him we detained a general." The young cop's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. General Davis remained silent, watching as the officer's confidence crumbled before him. The other officers didn't waste any time. One of them stepped forward, pulling the young cop aside. "You'd better have a damn good explanation for this," he growled. The officer's face turned beet red. He stuttered, trying to explain himself, but the words came out jumbled and nonsensical. Davis took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the cop who had wronged him. "I tried to warn you," he said again, his voice steady but cold. The tension in the air was palpable. The young officer knew he was in deep trouble, but he had no idea just how bad it was about to get. The young officer's legs felt like jelly as he stumbled back, overwhelmed by the weight of what he'd just done. His career, his reputation, and maybe even his freedom were now on the line. Lieutenant General Davis stood motionless, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. The two other officers on the scene had begun to assess the situation, their expressions grim as they glanced between Davis and the panicked rookie. "You've really stepped in it now," one of the senior officers muttered under his breath, shooting the young cop a glare. He turned to Davis, his voice more measured. "Sir, we deeply apologize for this incident. We'll make sure it's handled properly." But Davis wasn't interested in apologies. His focus remained on the rookie cop, whose face was now drenched in sweat. "What's your name, officer?" Davis asked quietly. The young man hesitated, swallowing hard. "Officer Ryan, sir. Dan Ryan." "Officer Ryan," Davis repeated, his tone steady but firm. "Do you often treat people this way, or was tonight special?" Ryan's mouth opened, but no words came out. His mind raced, but there was no excuse, no justification that could fix this. He had profiled a man, assaulted him, and in doing so, had laid bare the ugly truth of his biases. "Sir, I—" Davis held up a hand, silencing him. "Save it. I've heard every excuse before. I'm not here to educate you on right and wrong." He turned to the senior officer. "I want his badge number and a copy of the incident report by the morning." The senior officer nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir. We'll ensure everything is documented." By now, a small crowd had begun to gather nearby, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. People whispered among themselves, their phones raised to capture the unfolding drama. It wasn't long before someone recognized Davis. "Isn't that General Davis?" a woman in the crowd asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "He's a hero." The murmurs spread quickly, and soon the crowd's whispers grew louder. "That cop put him in handcuffs." "What's wrong with him?" "Doesn't he know who that is?" Ryan's face flushed an even deeper shade of red as the weight of public scrutiny pressed down on him. He could feel the judgmental stares, the disapproving murmurs. His hands fidgeted nervously, and he avoided making eye contact with anyone. Davis, meanwhile, was acutely aware of the crowd but remained composed. He had spent a lifetime in the public eye, and this wasn't the first time he had to maintain his dignity under pressure. One of the senior officers stepped forward, addressing the onlookers. "Everyone please disperse. There's nothing more to see here." The crowd began to thin out reluctantly, but not before a few more videos were taken. It was clear that this incident wouldn't remain a quiet local matter. The footage would soon find its way onto social media, where it would spark outrage and ignite a national conversation. As the last few onlookers trickled away, Davis finally spoke again. "Officer Ryan, you have a long night ahead of you. I suggest you use it to reflect on your actions." Ryan nodded weakly, unable to muster a response. "General," the senior officer interjected cautiously, "we'd like to escort you to the station to formally document your statement. It's standard procedure." Davis glanced at his watch. It was late, and all he wanted was to be home with his family. But he knew the importance of following through. "Very well," he said, his voice measured. "Let's get this over with." The short drive to the station was silent, tension hanging thick in the air. Ryan sat in the back of the squad car, his head bowed low, while Davis rode in a separate vehicle, his expression unreadable. When they arrived, the station buzzed with quiet activity. Officers who had been milling about snapped to attention the moment Davis walked through the doors. Whispers spread like wildfire as word of the incident circulated. The desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork, his eyes widening as he recognized Davis. "General Davis, sir. What brings you here?" Davis gave a slight nod. "I'm here to file a report. Let's keep it professional." The sergeant nodded quickly, motioning to a nearby office. "Of course, sir, right this way." Inside the office, Davis provided a detailed account of the night's events, sparing no detail. The senior officer took notes diligently, his face grim as he documented the incident. Meanwhile, Ryan sat outside the office, his leg bouncing nervously as he awaited his fate. The atmosphere in the station was tense. Everyone knew this wasn't a routine situation. A high-ranking military official had been wrongfully detained and assaulted by one of their own. It was a disaster waiting to explode. Once Davis finished giving his statement, he stood up, towering over the seated officer. "I trust you'll handle this matter with the seriousness it deserves," he said firmly. The senior officer nodded. "Absolutely, sir. We'll launch a full investigation immediately." As Davis exited the office, he locked eyes with Ryan one last time. For a brief moment, there was silence between them, a heavy, unspoken understanding. "You have a choice to make, Officer Ryan," Davis said quietly. "Decide what kind of man you want to be." With that, he turned and walked out of the station, his presence commanding respect even in the face of adversity. As he stepped into the cool night air, Davis felt a mix of emotions. Anger, frustration, and exhaustion weighed heavily on him, but so did a sense of resolve. This incident was more than just a personal affront. It was a stark reminder of the work that still needed to be done. Back at the station, Ryan remained seated, his head in his hands. He knew his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend, and as the gravity of his actions sank in, he could only hope that he'd find a way to make amends. But this was far from over. The storm was just beginning. The next morning, the storm hit. By dawn, the videos captured by onlookers were trending across every major social media platform. The hashtags #JusticeForGeneralDavis and #RacistCop exploded, accompanied by clips of the incident. The footage was damning. It showed Officer Ryan shoving General Davis against the car, handcuffing him, and ignoring his repeated attempts to de-escalate the situation. Commentary poured in from all corners, outraged citizens, veterans, public figures, and activists. "Unbelievable," a news anchor said during the morning broadcast. A decorated U.S. Army general, a man who has dedicated his life to serving this country, subjected to such treatment. And why? Because of the color of his skin. At home, Davis sat at his dining table, his phone buzzing non-stop with calls and messages. His wife, Angela, placed a cup of coffee in front of him, her face etched with concern. "Charles," she said softly, "they're all talking about it. Even the Secretary of Defense called." Davis nodded, rubbing his temples. "I expected this. It's not the first time something like this has happened, but it needs to be the last." Angela reached out and took his hand. "You did the right thing, standing your ground. People need to see this, to understand what we go through, even those who've served at the highest levels." Davis's phone buzzed again, this time with a name that made him pause. "President Carter." He answered immediately. "Good morning, Mr. President." "Davis," the president's voice was firm yet empathetic. "I just saw the footage. This is unacceptable. We're going to make sure this is handled properly. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, sir," Davis replied, more concerned about the larger issue. "This isn't just about me." "And it shouldn't be," the president agreed. "But this incident is a wake-up call for many. I want you to know you have my full support. We're going to address this head-on." As Davis ended the call, Angela squeezed his hand. "What did he say?" "He's backing us," Davis said. "But this is going to get bigger before it gets better." Meanwhile, at the police station, chaos reigned. Officer Ryan sat in the chief's office, his head low. Across the desk, Chief Walters glared at him, his jaw clenched tight. A printed copy of the official report sat in front of him, but it was clear he already knew the gravity of the situation. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Walters growled. "You put your hands on a U.S. Army general, a black general, at that. In today's climate, with cameras rolling. What were you thinking?" Ryan's voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't know who he was, Chief. He didn't comply right away, and I just followed procedure." "Procedure?" Walters slammed his hand on the desk. "You followed your prejudice, Ryan. Don't play dumb with me." Ryan flinched but remained silent. Walters took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair. "You're suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Turn in your badge and gun." Ryan's face crumpled. "Chief, please. Don't make this worse for yourself. Do as I say." Walters pointed to the door. "Get out." Ryan left the office in a daze, his mind spinning. Officers in the bullpen watched him with a mixture of pity and disgust. Whispers followed him as he walked out, badge and gun surrendered. He felt like a pariah. By midday, the press conference was underway. Chief Walters stood at the podium, flanked by local officials. Cameras flashed as reporters fired off questions. Is the department issuing a formal apology to General Davis? Will Officer Ryan face criminal charges? What steps are being taken to address racial profiling in your department? Walters held up his hands, signaling for quiet. First, I want to express my deepest apologies to Lieutenant General Davis on behalf of our department. What happened was inexcusable, and we're taking immediate steps to ensure accountability. He paused, his expression somber. Officer Ryan has been suspended, and an independent investigation is underway. Furthermore, we are launching a department-wide review of our practices, including mandatory bias training for all officers. The crowd murmured, some skeptical, others nodding approval. One reporter raised her hand. Chief Walters, has General Davis responded to the department's apology? Walters nodded. General Davis has been gracious despite the circumstances. He's expressed a desire to focus on systemic change rather than personal retribution. We're committed to working with him to address these critical issues. Later that evening, Davis sat in a private meeting with his attorney, Malcolm Reed, and a civil rights advocate, Dr. Elaine Harper. We have a strong case, Reed said, adjusting his glasses. The footage speaks for itself. If you want to pursue legal action, we can go after them for assault, unlawful detention, and racial discrimination. Davis shook his head. It's not about a lawsuit. This isn't just my fight. I want to use this platform to push for real change. Dr. Harper leaned forward. We can start with policy reforms, public accountability measures, stricter penalties for racial profiling, and community oversight committees. You got the public's attention, Charles. We need to keep the momentum going. Davis nodded, his resolve strengthening. Then let's do it. Whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. As the meeting continued, plans were set in motion for a nationwide campaign against racial profiling. Davis knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready for the fight. At the same time, Officer Ryan sat alone in his apartment, the weight of his actions crushing him. His suspension was just the beginning. He knew he'd soon be facing a formal investigation, and his name was already plastered across every news outlet. He picked up his phone, scrolling through the countless messages. Some were supportive, but most were harsh condemnations. The worst part was knowing they were right. He had made a terrible mistake, one that might define him for the rest of his life. As he stared at the screen, a notification popped up. Breaking news, General Davis speaks out. Ryan clicked the link, watching as Davis addressed the nation. I've spent my life serving this country, Davis said, his voice steady. But even after earning the highest ranks, I'm not immune to the realities that many Black Americans face every day. This isn't just about me. It's about justice, accountability, and the kind of future we want to build for the next generation. Ryan closed the video, his heart heavy. He knew he couldn't undo what he'd done, but maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make things right. The next few days brought a whirlwind of developments. General Davis's story dominated headlines, sparking debates on every news channel and social media platform. Civil rights organizations rallied behind him, organizing marches and calling for nationwide police reform. Public figures from all walks of life voiced their support, amplifying the message that this was not an isolated incident. At home, Davis prepared for what would be his most significant public address yet. The event was set to take place at the National Mall, a symbolic location for moments of profound historical importance. Angela stood by his side as he adjusted his uniform, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and concern. "Aren't you ready for this?" she asked softly. Davis gave her a small smile. "I've been ready my whole life. This fight didn't start yesterday, and it won't end tomorrow. But we're making progress." Angela nodded, her hand resting on his shoulder. "Just remember, you've got a whole nation behind you." The scene at the National Mall was electric. Thousands had gathered, holding signs that read "Justice Now" and "Racial Profiling and Accountability for All." The crowd spanned all ages and races, united by a shared demand for change. Davis stepped up to the podium, the roar of the crowd quieting as he began to speak. "I stand before you today not just as a general in the United States Army, but as a Black man who has experienced firsthand the reality of racial injustice. I've led troops in battle, defended this nation against foreign threats, but here at home, the fight is different. It's personal." He paused, letting his words sink in. The crowd listened intently, hanging on his every word. What happened to me was a painful reminder that no rank, no uniform, and no amount of service can shield you from prejudice. But this isn't just my story. It's the story of countless Black Americans who face discrimination every day, on the streets, in their workplaces, even in their own homes. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing across the mall. Davis raised his hand, signaling for quiet. This is a pivotal moment in our history. We have the power to demand accountability, to push for reforms that ensure every citizen is treated with dignity and respect. Together we can build a nation that lives up to its promises of liberty and justice for all. As Davis concluded his speech, the crowd rose to their feet, their voices united in a powerful chant, "Justice, justice, justice." Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the city, Officer Ryan sat alone in a dimly lit cafe, watching the live broadcast on his phone. Each word from Davis felt like a dagger, piercing through his guilt and shame. He knew he had become the face of everything wrong with the system, a symbol of prejudice and abuse of power. As the broadcast ended, Ryan felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see his older brother, Mark, who had served as a firefighter for years. Mark slid into the seat across from him, his expression grim. "Dan," Mark began, "I saw the news. You've got a long road ahead of you." Ryan nodded, his voice barely audible. "I messed up, Mark. I let my biases control me, and now I've ruined everything." Mark leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You're right, you did mess up. But sitting here feeling sorry for yourself won't fix anything. You need to own up to what you did and start making amends." Ryan sighed heavily. "I don't even know where to start." "Start by listening," Mark said firmly. "Learn from this. Understand why people are angry, why they feel the way they do. And when the time comes, take responsibility. You can't undo the past, but you can fight to be better." Ryan nodded slowly, his brother's words resonating. He knew Mark was right. Change wouldn't come easy, but it had to start somewhere. Back at the Davis household, the family gathered around the television, watching the news coverage of the rally. Angela sat beside her children, her hand resting on her daughter Maya's shoulder. Maya, just 13, looked up at her mother with wide eyes. "Mom," she said quietly, "why do people treat us differently because of our skin?" Angela's heart ached at the question, but she kept her voice steady. "Because some people judge others without really knowing them. They see our skin and make assumptions, but that doesn't define who we are." Maya nodded, her young mind trying to process the complexities of the world. "Do you think things will get better?" Angela smiled softly. "With people like your dad leading the way, I believe they will. But it's up to all of us to keep fighting for what's right." The days that followed were a mix of progress and challenges. The police department's internal investigation moved swiftly, with Officer Ryan facing mounting pressure. The Independent Review Board released a preliminary report highlighting systemic issues within the department, including a lack of adequate bias training and accountability measures. Chief Walters held another press conference, announcing a series of reforms aimed at rebuilding public trust. These included mandatory body cameras, independent oversight committees, and community engagement programs. But the road to justice was far from smooth. As support for Davis grew, so did the backlash from certain corners. Some groups criticized the movement, arguing that it painted law enforcement in an unfair light. The debates grew heated, with tensions rising both online and in the streets. One evening, as Davis prepared for another meeting with community leaders, Angela approached him with a concerned look. "Charles, I've been getting some threatening messages," she said, holding up her phone. "People who aren't happy about what you're doing." Davis's expression darkened. "I'll notify security. We're not taking any chances." Angela nodded, but the fear lingered. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Davis assured her. "But I won't back down." "Not now." As the movement gained momentum, a new challenge emerged. Late one night, Davis received a call from his attorney, Malcolm Reed. "Charles, we got a situation," Reed said, his tone serious. "There's been an attempt to leak false information about your service record. Someone's trying to discredit you." Davis clenched his jaw, his mind racing. "Do we know who's behind it?" "Not yet," Reed replied. "But we're digging. In the meantime, we'll need to address this head-on." The attack was personal, designed to undermine Davis's credibility and distract from the larger issue at hand. But Davis was prepared. He knew the fight for justice was never without resistance. As he hung up the phone, Davis took a deep breath, steeling himself for the battle ahead. The stakes were higher than ever, but his resolve remained unshaken. The fight was far from over. The smear campaign against General Davis escalated quickly. By morning, news outlets were buzzing with unverified claims, questioning his military record. Social media was ablaze, with some users sharing doctored documents and others coming to Davis's defense. At the Davis household, the atmosphere was tense. Angela sat with her phone in hand, scrolling through the latest headlines. Davis stood by the window, his eyes fixed on the horizon, deep in thought. "Charles," Angela called softly, "they're saying you lied about your service in Afghanistan." Davis turned to her, his expression calm but resolute. "And tomorrow, they'll say something worse. It's a tactic, Angela, an old one. When they can't argue against the truth, they attack the person telling it." Angela's eyes welled up with concern. But what if people believe them? Davis walked over, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They'll believe the truth when they see it, and they will." Later that day, Davis and his legal team held an emergency press conference. Standing before a sea of cameras, Davis projected a sense of unshakable confidence. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady. "Over the past 48 hours, certain individuals have attempted to discredit my service to this nation. Let me be clear. These claims are baseless and false." He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle. "I've dedicated my life to serving this country with honor and integrity. My record speaks for itself, and it's a matter of public record. I have nothing to hide." Malcolm Reed stepped forward, holding up a stack of documents. "We've obtained certified records from the Department of Defense verifying General Davis's distinguished service, including commendations for bravery in combat. These documents will be made available to the public." The crowd murmured as reporters frantically took notes. Davis continued, his tone firm. "This smear campaign is a distraction, an attempt to shift focus from the real issue at hand, systemic injustice and the urgent need for reform. We will not be deterred." The press conference ended with a standing ovation from supporters. The narrative began to shift as reputable journalists and military officials corroborated Davis's impeccable service record. The smear campaign quickly unraveled, but the damage it intended to inflict left a bitter aftertaste. Meanwhile, Officer Ryan's life continued to spiral. Suspended and under investigation, he found himself isolated, his name synonymous with disgrace. One evening, he sat in his dim apartment, scrolling through the endless stream of messages on his phone. Among the hate mail and threats, one message caught his attention. It was from a former colleague, a retired officer named James Holloway. "Dan, I saw the news. You've made some terrible choices, but it's not too late to learn. Meet me tomorrow at the community center. There's something you need to see." Ryan hesitated, unsure of what to expect. But deep down, he knew he couldn't keep hiding from the truth. The next day, he made his way to the address Holloway provided. The community center was bustling with activity. Inside, a group of volunteers was hosting a workshop on racial bias and police-community relations. Holloway greeted Ryan with a firm handshake and led him to a small room at the back. "This is where it starts," Holloway said, gesturing to a group of people seated in a circle. "Real conversations, real stories." Ryan took a seat, feeling out of place. One by one, participants shared their experiences with law enforcement, stories of fear, humiliation, and resilience. A young black man named Marcus spoke about being stopped and frisked multiple times on his way to school. An elderly woman recounted the day her grandson was falsely accused of a crime because he fit the description. Ryan listened in silence, each story hitting him like a punch to the gut. For the first time, he began to see the full scope of the harm caused by his actions and the system he represented. When the session ended, Holloway turned to Ryan. "This is what you need to understand, Dan. It's not just about one bad decision. It's about a pattern, a culture that's been allowed to persist for far too long. If you want to make things right, you need to start here." Ryan nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I want to learn. I want to do better." Back in Washington, the fight for reform reached a critical juncture. Davis and his team were scheduled to testify before a Congressional Committee on Police Accountability. The hearing was a highly anticipated event, with millions tuning in to watch. As Davis took his seat in the chamber, he felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about his personal ordeal. It was about setting a precedent for change. The committee chair, Senator Margaret Ellis, opened the session. "General Davis, we've all seen the footage of what happened to you. But today, we're here to address the broader issue of systemic bias and misconduct within law enforcement. Please share your thoughts." Davis leaned forward, his voice measured but powerful. "Thank you, Senator. What happened to me was a stark reminder of the deep-seated issues that many in our communities face every day. It's a failure of trust, accountability, and training. He went on to outline a series of proposed reforms, including increased oversight, mandatory bias training, and greater transparency in police operations. His testimony was both personal and pragmatic, drawing on his experiences as a leader and a black man in America. The hearing lasted for hours, with testimonies from other victims, experts, and advocates. By the end, it was clear that the push for reform had gained significant momentum. As night fell, Davis returned home, exhausted but hopeful. Angela greeted him with a warm hug, her eyes shining with pride. "You were incredible today," she said. "I think you really made an impact." Davis smiled. "It's a start, but there's still a long way to go." Just as they sat down for dinner, Davis's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "General Davis," a deep voice on the other end said. "This is Special Agent Collins with the FBI. We've been monitoring threats against you and your family. I'm afraid there's been a credible escalation." Davis's heart sank. "What kind of escalation?" "We've identified a group planning to target tomorrow's town hall meeting. We're taking every precaution, but we need you to be aware." Angela's eyes widened as she overheard the conversation. Davis gripped the phone tightly. "Understood. Keep me updated." As he ended the call, a heavy silence filled the room. The fight for justice had come at a steep cost, and now the stakes were higher than ever. The morning of the town hall arrived with an eerie stillness. General Davis stood at his bedroom window, watching the first light of dawn creep over the horizon. Angela sat on the edge of the bed, her worry unspoken but palpable. "Are you sure you should go today?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Davis turned to her, his expression firm but gentle. "If I back down now, everything we've fought for loses its momentum. Fear can't be what drives us." Angela nodded, though her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "Promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Davis assured her. "The FBI has increased security, and I'll have a full detail. We're not taking any chances." By noon, the town hall was packed. Hundreds of people filled the community center, and dozens more stood outside, holding signs of support. A palpable energy buzzed in the air, a mix of hope and tension. FBI agents were stationed discreetly around the venue, scanning the crowd for any signs of trouble. Officer Ryan, now a civilian awaiting the results of his investigation, stood at the back of the room, blending in. He had come uninvited, driven by a need to witness the change he hoped to be part of. As Davis took the stage, the room fell silent. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze steady. "Today we gather not just to talk about what's wrong, but to plan how we can make it right," he began. "Change doesn't come easy, and it doesn't come without sacrifice. But together we can create a system that works for everyone." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers filling the room. Davis continued, addressing issues of accountability, reform, and rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. His words resonated, sparking a sense of unity and purpose. Outside, however, danger loomed. A black van idled a few blocks away, its windows heavily tinted. Inside, 3 men sat, their faces hidden by baseball caps and scarves. The leader, a wiry man with sharp eyes, checked his watch. "It's time," he said, his voice low but commanding. The driver nodded, pulling the van into motion. They parked near the community center, blending in with the other vehicles. The leader opened a duffel bag, revealing an assortment of weapons. "We go in, create chaos, and get out. No mistakes." The men nodded, each grabbing their assigned weapon. They exited the van, moving swiftly toward the building. Inside the town hall, Davis was mid-sentence when the first crack of gunfire shattered the air. Screams erupted as the crowd scrambled for cover. Davis instinctively dropped behind the podium, his military training kicking in. FBI agents moved quickly, drawing their weapons and securing the exits. One agent, stationed near Davis, pulled him to safety behind a row of chairs. "Stay low, General," the agent said. "We'll get you out of here." The gunmen pushed their way into the hall, firing indiscriminately. Their leader shouted orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. "No one moves or more people die." Davis peeked over the edge of the chairs, his heart pounding. He could see the gunmen positioning themselves near the center of the room, their eyes scanning for him. One of the agents whispered into his earpiece, coordinating with the team outside. "We got hostiles inside, armed and dangerous. SWAT is en route." Amid the panic, Officer Ryan made a split-second decision. He moved carefully through the crowd, keeping low as he edged closer to the gunman. His training might have been tainted by poor judgment in the past, but today he could use it for good. Ryan spotted one of the gunmen reloading and seized his chance, He lunged, tackling the man to the ground. The gun clattered away, drawing the attention of the other assailants. "Get him!" the leader shouted, raising his weapon. Before he could fire, an FBI agent took the shot, hitting the leader in the shoulder. He stumbled back, dropping his gun. The remaining gunman hesitated, unsure whether to fight or flee. In that moment of hesitation, another agent tackled him, disarming him swiftly. Within minutes, the gunmen were subdued, their weapons confiscated. As the chaos subsided, Davis stood, surveying the aftermath. Despite the terror of the attack, the community's resolve had not wavered. People helped each other to their feet, checking on those who had been injured in the rush. Ryan, still on the ground next to the gunman he had tackled, looked up at Davis. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. "Officer Ryan," Davis said, his voice carrying a mix of surprise and acknowledgement. "General," Ryan replied, breathless. "I just wanted to help." Davis nodded, extending a hand to help Ryan up. "You did." Outside, the crowd gathered once more, shaken but determined. News of the thwarted attack spread quickly, with reporters already on the scene. Davis stood before the cameras once again, his voice unwavering. "Today, we faced violence meant to silence us. But we will not be silenced. Our fight for justice and equality continues, and we will not rest until every American can live without fear." The crowd erupted in applause, their chants of justice, louder and more resolute than ever. As night fell, Davis returned home, exhausted but resolute. Angela greeted him at the door, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You scared me today," she said, her voice trembling. "I know," Davis said softly, "but we made it through, and we're stronger for it." Angela pulled back, looking into his eyes. "Promise me, Charles. Promise me this fight won't take you away from us." Davis placed a hand on her cheek. "I promise. This fight is for us, for our family, for our future." As they sat together in the quiet of their home, Davis knew the battle was far from over. But with each challenge, he felt the tide turning, inch by inch, toward a better tomorrow. The next morning, the Davis household was quieter than usual. Angela was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast while their daughter, Maya, sat at the table scrolling through her tablet. The events of the previous day still lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable. Davis entered the kitchen, his face lined with exhaustion but his steps steady. He kissed Angela on the cheek and ruffled Maya's hair. "How's my favorite girl?" he asked, trying to inject some lightness into the somber atmosphere. Maya looked up, her eyes wide. "Dad, everyone's talking about you. You're on the news, in my friends' group chats. Even my teacher mentioned you." Angela placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of Davis. "She's right. You've become the face of this movement." Davis nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "It's bigger than me now. But that's the point. It's not everyone who's ever been overlooked or mistreated." Angela sat down, her gaze serious. "You've done so much already, Charles, but yesterday, it could have ended differently. I just want to make sure you're not pushing yourself too far." Davis reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I hear you, Angie, but every step we take is a step closer to lasting change. That's worth the risk." Maya chimed in, her voice small but determined. "You're a hero, Dad." Davis smiled, though the weight of the word hero pressed heavily on his shoulders. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Ryan was meeting with FBI Agent Collins in a small, sterile office. The previous day's events had thrust Ryan into the spotlight once again, but this time in different light. "Ryan," Collins began, his tone measured, "what you did yesterday was brave. You helped save lives." Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It doesn't erase what I've done." Collins leaned forward, his gaze steady. "No, it doesn't. But it shows you're willing to change. That matters." Ryan nodded, his jaw tight. "I want to make things right, whatever it takes." Collins slid a folder across the table. "The FBI is working on a community outreach program. We want to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they serve. You'd be a good fit." Ryan hesitated, his mind racing. "You think people will listen to me after everything?" Collins folded his arms. "People respect those who own their mistakes and work to fix them. This is your chance to be part of the solution." After a long pause, Ryan nodded. "I'm in." Back at the Davis residence, the phone rang incessantly. Angela answered, listening carefully before handing it to Davis. "It's Malcolm," she said. "He says it's urgent." Davis took the call, his face growing serious as he listened. "Understood. I'll be there." He hung up and turned to Angela. "They've scheduled a meeting with the Attorney General. It's not pushing forward with federal police reform legislation." Angela's eyes widened. "That's huge." "It is," Davis agreed. But it's also delicate. There's a lot of resistance, especially from certain political circles. Angela nodded. You'll handle it. You always do. The meeting took place in a sleek government building, the kind of place where history was often made behind closed doors. Davis sat at a long table surrounded by high-ranking officials, including the Attorney General, members of Congress, and representatives from civil rights organizations. The Attorney General, a stern woman with piercing eyes, addressed the room. We're here to discuss the next steps in crafting legislation aimed at addressing systemic issues in law enforcement. General Davis, your input has been invaluable thus far. What do you believe should be our top priority? Davis leaned forward, his voice steady but impassioned. Accountability. Without it, every other reform will fall flat. We need independent oversight, clear protocols for addressing misconduct, and real consequences for those who abuse their power. Several officials nodded in agreement, but one congressman, a man with a deep Southern drawl, raised his hand. General, while I appreciate your perspective, don't you think these measures could undermine the morale and effectiveness of our police forces? Davis's eyes locked onto the congressman's. Respectfully, sir, accountability doesn't undermine effectiveness. It enhances it. Good officers, the ones who truly serve their communities, have nothing to fear from oversight. In fact, they welcome it. It's those who operate without regard for justice that need to be held accountable. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Davis's words sinking in. The Attorney General nodded, signaling her agreement. Well said, General. Let's move forward with drafting these proposals. As Davis left the meeting, Malcolm Reed caught up with him. You did good in there, Malcolm said, his tone lighter than usual. Davis gave a small nod. It's a step in the right direction. Malcolm hesitated before speaking again. There's something else you should know. We've identified the group behind yesterday's attack. They call themselves the Purifiers. It's a fringe group, but they're well organized and dangerous. Davis's expression hardened. What's being done? The FBI is on it, Malcolm assured him. But they're not happy about how public this has all become. They'll likely try to disrupt more events. Davis sighed, the weight of the fight pressing down on him once more. We'll be ready. That evening, Davis sat with Angela on the porch, the cool night air surrounding them. They spoke quietly, reflecting on the day's events and the road ahead. You've come so far, Charles, Angela said. But this fight is bigger than any one person. Davis nodded. I know. That's why we can't stop now. As they sat in comfortable silence, the distant sound of sirens reminded them of the world they were working to change. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Davis felt a glimmer of hope. But just as things seemed to settle, a new threat emerged. The next morning, Davis received a chilling message. It was an anonymous email with a simple, ominous statement. We're watching you. Your family isn't safe. Davis's heart clenched. He immediately contacted Agent Collins, who assured him that security measures would be increased. But the threat was clear. The battle was no longer confined to public speeches and legislation. It had become deeply personal. And Davis knew that the enemy was closer than ever. The chilling email left General Davis restless. He sat in his study, the faint glow of his computer screen illuminating his furrowed brow. The message replayed in his mind. We're watching you. Your family isn't safe. It was a stark reminder that his fight for justice came with a cost. Angela appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed. You haven't slept, she said softly. I can't, Davis admitted. Not until I know you and the kids are safe. Angela walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. The FBI has increased security. We'll be fine. Davis nodded, though his heart remained heavy. This fight isn't just about me anymore, Angie. They're trying to break us. Angela knelt beside him, her gaze steady. Then we show them they can't. By morning, additional security measures were in place. Surveillance cameras were installed around the Davis property, and plainclothes agents patrolled the neighborhood. Despite the heightened precautions, life continued. Davis attended meetings, spoke at events, and pressed forward with legislative efforts. But the tension never left. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Davis's phone buzzed. It was a call from Agent Collins. General, we've traced the email, Collins said. It came from a server linked to the Purifiers. We believe they're planning something big. Davis's grip tightened on the phone. What's the plan? We've identified a possible location for their next meeting. We're organizing a raid, Collins explained. But I need you to keep a low profile until then. They're desperate, and that makes them unpredictable. Davis agreed, but his mind was already racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The raid took place 2 nights later. Under the cover of darkness, a team of FBI agents stormed a remote warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Inside, they found weapons, tactical gear, and plans for a coordinated attack on an upcoming rally where Davis was scheduled to speak. Collins called Davis as soon as the raid concluded. "We've disrupted their plans," he said, "but some members of the group are still at large. We're doing everything we can to track them down." Davis thanked him, but the victory felt hollow. The threat wasn't over, and he knew the purifiers wouldn't back down easily. The following week, Davis stood before another packed auditorium, addressing a crowd eager for change. He spoke with passion, detailing the progress being made and the work that still lay ahead. The energy in the room was electric, a testament to the growing movement. But as he spoke, his sharp eyes scanned the crowd, ever vigilant. Near the back, a figure caught his attention. A man in a dark jacket, standing still amidst the sea of people. His face was obscured, but something about his posture set Davis on edge. He continued his speech, but his focus remained split. He subtly signaled to one of his security detail, who nodded and moved toward the man. As the speech concluded, the crowd erupted in applause. Davis stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding as he watched the security team escort the man out of the building. Minutes later, Agent Collins approached him backstage. "The man we pulled from the crowd had a concealed weapon. He's in custody now," said he was there to send a message. Davis felt a cold wave of anger and relief wash over him. "They're getting bolder." "They are," Collins agreed. "But we're not letting them win." Back at home, Davis gathered his family in the living room. Angela sat beside him, holding his hand tightly. Maya and their son, Jacob, listened intently as Davis spoke. "I won't lie to you," he said. "We're in a dangerous time. There are people who want to stop what we're doing, and they'll go to many lengths." Maya looked up at him, her young face full of determination. "But we're not giving up, right?" Davis smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "Never." Jacob, older and more aware of the risks, asked, "What if they come after us again?" "They might," Davis admitted. "But we're stronger together, and we have people protecting us." Angela squeezed his hand. "As long as we stand together, we'll face whatever comes." The next morning, Davis received another call from Collins. "General, we've picked up chatter about another threat. It seems they're regrouping faster than we anticipated." "What's their target?" Davis asked. Collins hesitated. "It's personal this time. They're planning to target your home." Davis's blood ran cold. "When?" "We don't have a timeline yet, but we're increasing surveillance and stationing more agents nearby. You'll be safe," Collins assured him. Davis hung up, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't take any chances. He called Angela, who was out running errands, and told her to return home immediately. Then he gathered the kids and briefed them on the situation. By evening, the house felt like a fortress. Agents patrolled the perimeter, and every door and window was locked tight. The family huddled together, the weight of the threat heavy in the air. As the night wore on, the tension grew unbearable. Every creak and shadow set them on edge. Davis sat by the front window, his eyes scanning the dark street. Suddenly, a low rumble broke the silence. Headlights appeared in the distance, moving slowly toward the house. Davis stood, his heart pounding. The car stopped just short of the driveway. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the sound of a car door opening shattered the silence. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the headlights. Davis reached for his phone, dialing Collins. "They're here." The figure stepped closer, their movements deliberate. Davis's pulse quickened as he watched, every muscle in his body tense. Before he could react further, the figure raised a hand and hurled something toward the house. The object hit the ground with a dull thud, rolling to a stop near the front porch. It was a canister, and it was hissing. The hissing canister emitted a thin stream of gas that quickly began to spread. General Davis's instincts kicked in immediately. "Angela, kids, get to the safe room, now," he shouted, his voice cutting through the tense air. Angela didn't hesitate. She grabbed Maya and Jacob, ushering them toward the reinforced door in the hallway. The kids' eyes were wide with fear, but they followed their mother without question. Davis stayed behind, his focus locked on the canister. Through the window, he saw the figure retreating toward the idling car. His phone was still pressed to his ear. "Collins, we've got a gas canister on the porch." "Unknown substance," Davis said, his voice low and urgent. "We're sending a team now. Get your family to safety," Collins replied. Davis backed away from the window, his eyes stinging slightly as the gas seeped through the cracks around the door. He grabbed a wet towel from the kitchen and pressed it to his face, then made his way to the safe room, locking the heavy door behind him. Inside, Angela was holding the kids close, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. The room was equipped with a ventilation system, designed to keep them safe from situations just like this. "Everyone okay?" Davis asked, his voice muffled by the towel. Angela nodded. "We're fine. What about out there?" "Collins is sending a team. We just have to hold tight," Davis said, his tone steady despite the chaos. Outside, the agents stationed around the property moved quickly. One of them, positioned near the street, spotted the figure heading back to the car. He raised his weapon, shouting, "Freeze! Hands where I can see them." The figure paused for a split second before bolting toward the vehicle. The agent fired a warning shot into the air, but the figure managed to dive into the passenger seat. The car sped off, tires screeching as it disappeared into the night. Within minutes, the FBI's response team arrived, surrounding the Davis home. Agents in protective gear neutralized the gas canister and began analyzing the substance. Meanwhile, others worked to secure the perimeter and track the fleeing suspects. Collins arrived shortly after, his face grim as he approached the safe room. Davis opened the door, his family still huddled inside. "Everyone all right?" Collins asked, his eyes scanning the room. "We're fine," Davis replied. "What's the situation?" "The substance appears to be a non-lethal irritant, meant to cause panic rather than harm. But this was clearly a warning," Collins said. Angela's face tightened. "They want us to know they can get close." Collins nodded. "And they're escalating? We've got leads on the vehicle, and we'll find them. But General, we need to consider relocating your family until we neutralize this threat." Davis glanced at Angela, who gave a small nod. "Do what you need to do," she said firmly. By dawn, the Davis family was relocated to a secure location, an undisclosed safe house managed by federal agents. The house was modest but well fortified, with surveillance systems and 24/7 security. As the family settled in, Davis's mind remained on high alert. He knew the battle wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The purifiers wanted to intimidate him, to make him second-guess every step. But if anything, their attack only strengthened his resolve. Meanwhile, the FBI intensified their hunt for the attackers. Surveillance footage from the neighborhood provided a partial license plate, and within hours, they traced the vehicle to a rental company. The name on the rental agreement led them to a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. A tactical team assembled, moving swiftly to the location. They breached the room, finding 2 men inside. One of them was the figure from the Davis home, still wearing the dark jacket from the night before. Both were taken into custody without incident. At the FBI field office, Collins interrogated the suspects. The man in the dark jacket, identified as Ethan Holt, was uncooperative at first, his demeanor smug. "You're wasting your time," Holt sneered. "You think arresting me changes anything? There are more of us, and we won't stop." Collins leaned in, his voice low but menacing. "You came after a decorated U.S. Army general and his family. You're done. The only thing left for you to decide is how much worse this gets for you." Holt's smug expression faltered slightly. He knew the gravity of his situation, but his loyalty to the purifiers held firm for now. Back at the safe house, Davis received the update from Collins. "We've got 2 of them in custody. They'll face federal charges, but we're still working to dismantle the rest of the group." "Good work," Davis said. "But we both know this isn't over." "No, it's not," Collins agreed. "We'll stay vigilant." After the call, Davis returned to the living room, where Angela and the kids were watching a movie. He sat beside them, his presence a silent reassurance. Despite the immediate danger being contained, the weight of the fight still loomed. Maya leaned against him, her voice soft. "Are we safe now, Dad?" Davis wrapped an arm around her. "We're safer, and we'll keep fighting to make sure everyone is." Angela smiled at him, her eyes reflecting both pride and exhaustion. "We'll get through this, together." Davis nodded, his resolve as strong as ever. The enemy had tried to shake him, but they had only fortified his determination. The fight for justice for his family and for a better future was far from over, and he wouldn't stop until it was won. The following days at the safe house were tense but quiet. The Davis family adjusted to their new routine under constant protection, while General Davis continued to push forward with his mission. He spent hours on calls with lawmakers, civil rights leaders, and his legal team, strategizing the next steps in the fight for reform. Despite the temporary calm, Davis knew that the purifiers were still out there. Their ideology wasn't something that could be easily dismantled, even with arrests. He had faced many battles in his life, but this one felt different, more personal, more insidious. One evening, as Davis prepared for another virtual town hall, Agent Collins called with an update. "General, we got a lead on another purifier cell. This one's in a rural part of the state. They've been communicating through encrypted channels, planning another attack," Collins explained. Davis's jaw tightened. "What's their target?" "We don't have specifics yet, but it's likely tied to one of your upcoming events. We're moving in on them tonight." Davis nodded. "Be careful, Collins." "We will," Collins assured him. "In the meantime, keep your family secure. We've got additional agents on standby if you need them." After ending the call, Davis sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Angela entered the room, her expression soft but concerned. "Another lead?" she asked, sitting beside him. Davis nodded. "They're planning something, but Collins and his team are on it." Angela reached for his hand. "Charles, you've done so much already. It's okay to let others carry some of this burden." "I know," Davis said, his voice low. "But it's hard to step back when you know what's at stake." Angela smiled gently. "That's why we believe in you, but you're not alone in this." Later that night, Davis joined the virtual town hall, where hundreds of supporters and community leaders had gathered online. Despite the physical distance, the sense of unity was palpable. People shared their stories, their hopes, and their determination to keep pushing for change. As Davis spoke, his words carried a weight that resonated deeply. This movement isn't about one person or one moment. It's about a collective commitment to justice. Together, we're building a future where accountability isn't just a promise, it's a reality. The virtual crowd erupted in applause, their support evident even through the screen. But just as the meeting was wrapping up, Davis received a message from Collins. "Urgent. Call me." Davis excused himself and stepped away, dialing Collins immediately. "We've hit a snag," Collins said, his voice tense. "The raid didn't go as planned. The cell was tipped off and fled before we arrived." Davis's stomach sank. "Do we know where they're headed?" "We're tracking their movements, but they're staying off the grid. We'll find them, but this complicates things," Collins admitted. Davis clenched his fist. "Let me know as soon as you have something." The next day, the FBI's search intensified. Helicopters scored rural areas, and roadblocks were set up on major highways. Despite their efforts, the group remained elusive. Meanwhile, Davis's work continued. He met virtually with a coalition of lawmakers to finalize the draft of a police reform bill. The legislation was ambitious, aiming to implement sweeping changes in law enforcement practices, including mandatory body cameras, independent oversight, and stricter accountability measures. "This bill represents a turning point," Davis said during the meeting. "It won't solve everything overnight, but it's a critical step forward." The lawmakers nodded in agreement, recognizing the significance of the moment. That evening, as the Davis family sat down for dinner, the atmosphere was lighter. Maya and Jacob shared stories from their online classes, and for a brief moment, life felt normal again. But the fragile peace was shattered by a sudden knock at the door. Angela froze, her eyes darting to Davis. "Were we expecting anyone?" Davis shook his head, rising slowly. He motioned for Angela and the kids to move to the safe room while he approached the door. One of the agents stationed inside followed him, weapon drawn. "Who's there?" Davis called out, his voice steady. A muffled voice responded, "Agent Foster, FBI. It's urgent." Davis glanced at the agent beside him, who nodded and opened the door. Foster stepped inside, his face grim. "We've intercepted new intel," Foster said quickly. "The purifiers have regrouped, and they're planning to strike tonight." Davis's heart raced. "Where?" Foster hesitated. "Here. They'd somehow track you to the safe house." Angela, who had been listening from the hallway, gasped, "How did they find us?" Foster shook his head. "We're still investigating, but our priority is getting you out of here safely." Davis nodded, his military training taking over. "What's the plan?" "We have a convoy ready to move you to a secondary location," Foster explained, "but we need to leave immediately." Angela gathered the kids, who were visibly shaken but complied without protest. The family quickly packed a few essentials while the agents secured the perimeter. As the convoy pulled away from the safe house, Davis couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The road ahead was long and dark, the tension in the air almost suffocating. Suddenly, the lead vehicle came to an abrupt stop. Davis leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he tried to see what was happening. Foster's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got a roadblock ahead. Possible hostile engagement." Davis's heart pounded. "Get ready," he told his family, his voice calm but firm. In the distance, figures emerged from the shadows, weapons drawn. The purifiers had found them, and they weren't letting up. The night air was thick with tension as the convoy came to a halt. General Davis could see the figures in the distance, their silhouettes illuminated by the faint glow of the convoy's headlights. They were heavily armed, blocking the road with makeshift barricades. Agent Foster's voice crackled through the radio. "We're assessing the situation, but this isn't a random block. They're prepared." Davis turned to Angela and the kids. "Stay low. No matter what happens, stay inside the vehicle." His tone left no room for argument. Angela nodded, pulling Maya and Jacob close. "We're not going anywhere." The convoy's lead agent exited his vehicle cautiously, his weapon drawn. He signaled for the other agents to form a defensive perimeter. The purifiers didn't move, their weapons trained on the convoy. "Stand down," the lead agent shouted. "This area is secured by federal agents. Lay down your weapons and surrender." A voice called back from the darkness, cold and defiant. "You're not in control here. Send Davis out, and we'll let the rest of you walk away." Davis clenched his jaw. The purifiers weren't bluffing. They had planned this ambush carefully, knowing it was their best chance to strike a decisive blow. Inside the car, Davis's mind raced. He couldn't allow his family or the agents to become collateral damage. He grabbed the radio and spoke directly to Foster. "We need a diversion." Foster's reply was immediate. "We've got backup en route, but it'll take time. What are you thinking?" Davis's voice was calm but resolute. "I'm stepping out. It's needed. What?" Angela's eyes widened in horror. "Charles, no, you can't." "It's the only way to keep you safe," Davis said, his voice firm but gentle. "I won't let them hurt you." Before Angela could protest further, Davis opened the car door and stepped out into the cool night. The agents around him tensed, their weapons aimed at the purifiers. The leader of the purifiers stepped forward, his face partially visible under a hood. He held a rifle steady, his eyes locked on Davis. "General Davis," the man sneered, "the symbol of everything we stand against." Davis raised his hand slightly, his posture calm despite the danger. "You don't have to do this. Surrender now, and no one gets hurt." The leader laughed bitterly. "Do you really think we're afraid of your empty promises? You've made yourself the face of a corrupt system, and tonight, we're going to send a message." Suddenly, the sound of distant sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Backup was on its way. The leader's expression hardened. "Looks like your friends are late to the party. No matter, this ends now." He raised his rifle, but before he could fire, a deafening crack echoed through the night. One of the FBI agents had taken the shot, hitting the leader's shoulder. He stumbled backward, his rifle falling to the ground. Chaos erupted. The remaining purifiers opened fire, and the agents returned fire in a coordinated defense. Davis ducked behind one of the vehicles, shouting into the radio, "Secure the family and hold your ground." Inside the car, Angela shielded the kids as the gunfire intensified. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, though her own fear was palpable. The agents worked methodically, their training evident as they advanced on the purifiers. One by one, the attackers were subdued, their weapons confiscated. Within minutes, the gunfire ceased, replaced by the sound of heavy breathing and the distant wail of sirens. Foster approached Davis, his weapon still drawn. "We've secured the area. The remaining suspects are in custody." Davis stood, his eyes scanning the scene. The purifier's leader was being loaded into an ambulance, his face twisted in pain but defiant. The others were handcuffed and placed in the back of patrol cars. As the situation stabilized, Davis returned to the car. He opened the door to find Angela still holding the kids close. Their faces were pale, but they were unharmed. "It's over," Davis said softly, his voice heavy with relief. "You're safe." Angela pulled him into a tight embrace, her hands trembling. "You scared me, Charles." "I'm sorry," Davis whispered, "but we made it." Later that night, the family was relocated to a new safe house, this one even more secure than the last. As they settled in, Davis received a call from Collins. "General, this was a major blow to the purifiers. We've captured their key leaders and dismantled one of their largest cells. It's a victory." Davis nodded, but his exhaustion was evident. "Good work, Collins. But this fight isn't just about taking down one group. We have to keep pushing for systemic change." "And we will," Collins assured him. Thanks to you, the momentum is on our side." After ending the call, Davis sat in the quiet living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. Angela joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We've come so far," she said softly, "but I know this isn't the end." Davis nodded. "No, it's not. But every battle we win brings us closer to the world we're fighting for." Angela smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "And we'll face it together." As the night wore on, Davis allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The road ahead was still long, but for now, his family was safe, and the fight for justice continued. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains of the new safe house. The Davis family was up early, the tension from the previous night still lingering. Despite the fortified security, Angela kept a watchful eye on the kids, while Davis prepared for another long day of meetings and calls. After breakfast, Davis sat in front of his laptop, ready for a virtual press conference. Today, he would address the nation, speaking not only about the recent attack, but also about the broader fight for justice and reform. When the cameras went live, Davis's face filled screens across the country. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of everything he had endured. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "Last night, my family and I were targeted in a coordinated attack. This was not just an attack on us. It was an attack on the values we stand for, on justice, equality, and accountability." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. "Let me be clear. We will not be intimidated. We will not back down. This movement is bigger than any one person or family. It is a collective fight for a better, fairer society." Across the nation, people listened intently. Some nodded in agreement, inspired by his resilience. Others felt a renewed sense of urgency, ready to join the fight. "We have made progress," Davis continued. "We've seen communities come together, lawmakers take action, and policies begin to change. But there is still much work to be done, and we will not stop until every American can live without fear of discrimination or injustice." The press conference concluded with a standing ovation from those present in the virtual audience. Davis's message was clear. The fight was far from over, but together, they would persevere. Later that day, Davis met with key lawmakers and civil rights leaders to finalize the police reform bill. The discussions were intense, with every detail scrutinized to ensure the legislation would have a meaningful impact. As the meeting wrapped up, Senator Ellis, one of the bill's strongest supporters, turned to Davis. "General, your leadership has been instrumental in getting us this far. When this bill passes, it will be a testament to your courage and determination." Davis gave a small nod. "This isn't about me, Senator. It's about the millions of people who've been waiting for justice. They're the ones who inspire me to keep going." Ellis smiled. "Well, let's make history together." Back at the safe house, the family gathered for a quiet evening. The kids were playing a board game, their laughter filling the room. Angela sat beside Davis, her hand resting on his. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice soft. "You faced so much, but you never wavered." Davis smiled, his eyes reflecting both gratitude and exhaustion. "I couldn't have done it without you." Angela leaned her head against his shoulder. "We're in this together, Charles, no matter what comes next." That night, as Davis lay in bed, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The fight for justice had been long and arduous, filled with moments of triumph and heartbreak. But through it all, he had remained steadfast, driven by a vision of a better future. The next morning, the news broke. The police reform bill had been introduced in Congress. It was a historic moment, one that signaled a turning point in the fight for justice. Lawmakers and activists praised Davis for his leadership, and the nation watched closely as the bill moved through the legislative process. Though there were still battles to be fought, Davis felt a renewed sense of hope. The seeds of change had been planted, and now it was up to everyone to nurture them. A few weeks later, Davis stood on the steps of the Capitol, surrounded by supporters, as the police reform bill was signed into law. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the city. Davis turned to Angela, who stood beside him, and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Angela smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it, Charles. You never gave up." As the crowd chanted for justice and equality, Davis felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. The fight wasn't over, but they had achieved something monumental. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that a brighter future was within reach.